150 Aboriginal children were taken away from their homes and put in residential schools across Canada. In these residential schools between the years of 1874 to 1996, children suffered emotional abuse, neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and spiritual abuse. As a nursing student, and in learning this in my curriculum, I asked myself, how does this impact the individual that experienced this? How did it impact their families? How did it impact their communities? And how does it impact our society? I believe that incorporating Indigenous knowledge and Aboriginal health into nursing curriculum and health sciences is a way to honor the truth and reconciliation that needs to happen within Canada. I'd like to give you a bit of my history. And I grew up in Montreal and took history in high school, and then moved to BC also and did grade 12, and then did post-secondary school as well. And I took history there too. And we did cover Aboriginal health, and we did cover Indigenous people within Canada. But when it was covered, it was very much as something that happened in a long ago past. The stats that we learned and the trauma that was discussed made it feel like it happened a really long time ago. I then became a nursing student 10 years later, and in our nursing curriculum, I found out about residential schools. I found out about the trauma that assimilation does on a community and on a people into the dominant culture. And I learned about the crisis that is Aboriginal health in Canada. And this brought up two things for me. One, I was outraged at the social injustices that had happened in Canada in my generation. While I was in high school, other people were also in high school in residential schools, which brings up the second point that it brought up for me. How did I, a bright, engaged student who is involved politically, get to 29 years old and never hear about what a residential school is? How did I not know? I'd like to tell you a story about one of my practice placements that occurred in my nursing curriculum. A group of students and I went to Alert Bay to watch the symbolic demolition of St. Michael's School, residential school. I say symbolic because they only tore down the front, not porch, but the front entranceway, because the asbestos would have been too toxic to tear it down while the people were there. So the actual demolition occurred actually just a couple weeks ago, but it is down. By going there with fellow students, we were able to listen to the stories of some of the survivors. And as I watched the crowd, one elder was sitting there with the original suitcase, tiny little suitcase that she brought with her, and the contents that she had brought with her when she was 5 years old. And it had a teddy in it and a couple of clothing. And I looked at the size of it, and I looked at the picture of her when she was 5, and it broke my heart. And I thought of my 5-year-old son. And I thought of what that must have felt like as a parent taking my child against my will and bringing them to this school and leaving them there. And I thought of what that would feel like to not be able to impart my own culture and heritage to my son and have that right taken away from me. And then I thought of what that must have felt like for that little girl. And I think of my son and how vulnerable he is, and at the tender age of 5, going to this school and not knowing that I was going to be left there, and not knowing that I was going to lose all contact with my culture, and then the abuse that would ensue. And throughout that person's childhood, not having a family or community or people that loved me to support me through all the milestones of my childhood, what would that feel like? And when you hear the stories of the survivors, it makes it very real. It's different about learning this in the context of a textbook and then hearing the words out of someone's mouth. One of the other stories that impacted me the most was one survivor talked about when he was 5 years old, being brought up to the school, holding his mom's hand, not realizing that he would not see her very often in the next 12 years of his life. His brothers and sisters were separated from him and sent to all different schools across BC, and that door had a lot of significance for him. Then he talked about 12 years later, standing on the edge of this stairwell on what should have been, as he described, the most exciting day of his life, his graduation day, and standing on the edge of those stairs and looking out and realizing he did not know who he was. He felt lost, he felt alone, he had no connection to his culture, to his people, and to who he was as an individual. He also talked about the abuse that he had, some of the abuse that he had endured, and the fact that now he was mostly deaf in both ears because he had been hit on the side of the head so many times for either speaking his language or talking about his culture. So I look at those steps and I am outraged that this happened in Canada in my lifetime and in my parents' lifetime. And then it doesn't seem so long ago. Then I look at the number again, 150,000 children. That's 300,000 parents who also suffered that trauma. That's 600,000 grandparents who suffered that trauma. And the number of children now of those children that are also impacted. And then I wonder, what is the impact on health and our society? Because that number seems way more significant, and it seems not in a distant past. And then I ask, how does this affect healthcare? So knowing the stats and the crisis that we see in Aboriginal health right now, obviously that residential schools have had an impact on people's ability to have a family unit, be a part of their community, and to build a solid society. Another story that I'd like to share is when I went to the Canadian Nursing Student Association, had a national conference that happened in Vancouver last year. And one of the keynote speakers was Tanya Dick, who is a Aboriginal nurse, a nurse leader, and she talked about her experiences in the healthcare system as an Aboriginal nurse and what she saw from her people. She talked about her parents, who actually attended St. Mike's residential school, and the intergenerational impact that it's had on her and her siblings, and the trauma and how abuse stems past the people that were initially traumatized. She also talked about the current racism that is still prevalent in healthcare, and how her uncle, who entered an emergency room in Vancouver and sat and waited because he was having a health crisis, but the Emerge people thought that he was just intoxicated and let him sleep it off, and he actually died. That's not an uncommon story in Canada, unfortunately, and that's also an extreme story, but there's a lot of varying other stories in between of neglect, abuse within our healthcare system that is the epitome of racism. So the shocking part after her story was that there was a Q&A after she had done her speech, and students were allowed to get up and ask questions. So students across Canada from very prestigious universities, and some students in their third and fourth year of their degree were getting up and asking questions like, what is a residential school? And why did this happen to your family? And is this common? That's concerning. My fellow NIC students who were sitting at the table with us all looked at each other, and we realized that not everybody knows about this, and not everyone is aware of the impacts. And that's disturbing, as far as the fact that we are the largest number of healthcare workers. Our body, as RNs, makes up the largest body of healthcare workers in Canada. And we ask the question, how, without this knowledge and context, how can we provide holistic care? How can we provide one-on-one care to an individual who is Aboriginal, who has gone to a residential school or has intergenerational abuse because of the traumas of residential school? And how can we be culturally safe in our care without any understanding or knowledge of this context? And then on another level, nurses are very political. We are engaged in health reform and health policy. And so if we are unaware as a body of what has happened to Indigenous people of our country, how can we actually be politically active and have a voice for these people? So myself and 3 other students decided that we wanted to get politically active to make a change. We created a resolution and position statement for the Canadian Nursing Student Association, and it was creating a partnership for Aboriginal health promotion. And basically what we were asking the CNSA to engage in was that we mandate that every school across Canada encourages having Aboriginal health and Indigenous knowledge incorporated into their course curriculum. I also believe that that's important for all health sciences, but I'm focusing on nursing. So the Canadian Nursing Student Association has a voting right on the Canadian Nursing Association of Canada, which is the representative for all RNs within Canada. And hopefully, within that voice, we can create some change. So by incorporating Indigenous knowledge and Aboriginal health into nursing curriculum, we hope that we can create some cultural safety, foster reconciliation, ignite social justice, and promote healing. And I would ask that everyone here also engage in dialogue, because throughout my journey, my biggest 2 aha moments have been, 1, it's a very uncomfortable topic. It's not fun to talk about. It creates uncomfort, and a lot of tension is involved in discussing Aboriginal health and the crisis in our country. And I think that it requires courage to do so, but I think that it's important. Even as I was writing this speech, there's so much ambiguity within the language that is used, and it's difficult. It is difficult to talk about, but it is important if we're actually going to create change. The second thing that I realized, especially as a future healthcare worker, is that it's important for me to challenge and have the courage to challenge my own assumptions and beliefs and what I have carried by not knowing about this, and my white privilege and all of the racism that I have learned throughout my curriculum as a Canadian, and the fact that this is not a part of the regular school system. So I would ask everyone to ask how they can make a difference with this knowledge and engage in dialogue to discuss how we can have an impact as an individual, as a family, as a community, and as a society. Thank you.